Vasishta continued, O Ram, the unreal jiva perceives the unreal world on account of the unreal influence of the unreality. In all this, what can be considered as real and what as unreal? An imaginary object is imaginatively described by someone, and one understands it in one's own imagination and imagines that he understands it. This goes on all the time, doesn't it? When we're children, we get told fairy stories, fairy tales. Sometimes we're told these stories as if they're true. For example, the story of Santa Claus. At some point we learn that Santa Claus is not regarded as true. So we have to come to terms with that. We might be told stories of dragons and sorcerers, but eventually we come to realise that it's generally understood that dragons and sorcerers don't really exist. Although some cultures might say otherwise, depends on which culture you grow up in. Some cultures think that dreams are important, and some don't. Some stress the stories of physical reality as that's being what's real, and dreams are only dreams, whereas some cultures say the dream reality is more important than the physical reality. Some cultures have stories of afterlife, the afterlife, and how that's more important than this actual life that's happening now. So we've got these stories that are imaginatively described, which we understand in our imagination. We believe we understand it, we imagine that we understand it. We might even take them as true. Conspiracy theories are a good one, aren't they? People love conspiracy theories. Anyway, we won't go into all that. Just as liquidity is in liquids, motion in wind, emptiness in space, even so is omnipresence in the self. Liquidity in liquids. Liquidity is a characteristic of liquids. Motion is a characteristic of wind. Emptiness is a characteristic of space. Omnipresence is a characteristic of the self. Well, that's interesting. And how does this follow on from what we've just been saying? Well, the first couple of sentences were all about unreality and imagination. It's all about notions. All we have here is, if we turn our attention to the self, then this is the sole reality. It's all there is. And this is what omnipresence means. We tend to project omnipresence onto stuff out there. We think of omnipresence as something which goes on not just here but in other countries. But all omnipresence means is the sole reality. It's not unreality, it's not imagination. The self is characterized by what is right here, right now. And this is omnipresence. From the time the Lord instructed me, I have been performing the worship of the infinite self. By the grace of such worship, though I am constantly engaged in various activities, I am free from sorrow. I perform the worship of the self who is undivided, though apparently divided, with the flowers of whatever comes to me naturally and whatever actions are natural to me. We've got here the language of worship, which is very central to the Hindu context. But this worship is no different from practice, the practice of self-remembering. And it's going on no matter what the circumstances. Vasishta here is talking from the perspective of the spiritual practitioner. No matter what happens, you live in continual realization of the self, which is the one awareness, the attention. To come into relationship, to possess and to be possessed, is common to all embodied beings, but the yogis are forever vigilant. and such vigilance is the worship of the self. So you continually realize the self. When you come into a relationship with something or somebody, it's about, and here it's described as to possess and to be possessed. That's to subscribe to notions of ownership. But what happens is you put your identity onto that thing. You put your attention onto that thing. And this is quite obvious in romantic relationships. You shift your center of emotion out there onto that person. You take your cue for your feelings from that person over there. At this point you're quite lost, although it might be giddy and wonderful at the time. Spiritually it's a disaster. You've totally turned yourself on your head in the mistaken belief that this is love. And love has got nothing to do with that. Love is being centered in yourself, and from that position being completely open and accepting of the other person, not trying to imagine everything from their point of view, which you can't do. It's just you actually injecting your ego into them. Adopting this inner attitude, and with a mind utterly devoid of any attachment, I roam in this dreadful forest of samsara, world appearance. If you do so, you will not suffer. In other words, if you adopt the inner attitude of vigilance, of identifying with the self, then you won't be subjected to psychological distress. When great sorrow, like the loss of wealth and relations, befalls you, inquire into the nature of truth in the manner described. You will not be affected by joy or sorrow. You now know how all these things arise and how they cease. And you also know the fate of the man who is deluded by them, who does not inquire into their real nature. They do not belong to you, you do not belong to them. Such is the unreal nature of the world. Do not grieve. Dear Ram, you are pure consciousness, which is not affected by the illusory perception of the diversity of creation. If you see this, how will notions of the desirable and the undesirable arise in you? Realizing thus, O Ram, remain established in the Turiya, transcendental state of consciousness. Or it's simply consciousness. Let your consciousness be established in consciousness. Ram said, Lord, I am free from the dirt of duality. I have realized that all this is indeed Brahman. My intelligence has been purified, rid of doubts and desires and even questions. I do not desire heaven, nor do I dread hell. I remain established in the self. By your grace, O Lord, I have crossed this ocean of samsara, world appearance. I have realized the fullness of direct self-knowledge. And this is worship of the omnipresent, non-dual self.